They didn't even let him say goodbye. Officer Daniel Reed sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his wrists shackled to the metal table as the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. Just yesterday, he was a respected officer, patrolling the streets with his K-9 partner, Shadow, by his side. Now, his own department had turned against him, accusing him of corruption, evidence tampering, crimes he never committed. His badge was gone, his uniform stripped, and worst of all, Shadow had been taken away from him without so much as a final command. The thought of his partner, confused and waiting for him to return, sent a sharp pain through his chest. The officers outside that door, the same ones who once called him brother, now refused to meet his eyes. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was just another suspect. "Just let me see him." Daniel's voice was hoarse, desperate. One last time. The detective across from him barely glanced up from his file, his expression unreadable. "He's being reassigned," he said flatly. That single word cut deeper than anything else. Reassigned. Shadow would be given a new handler, forced to forget the bond they had built over years of trust and loyalty. But Shadow wasn't just a K-9. He was Daniel's partner, his protector, his family. The idea of never seeing him again felt like a punishment worse than the accusations against him. Then, just as he was about to lose hope, something happened. A commotion echoed from the hallway, raised voices, the scuffling of boots against the tile floor, and then a deep, familiar growl. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that sound anywhere. Shadow was here. The door burst open, and in that moment, everything changed. The interrogation room was a suffocating box of silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the flickering overhead light. The air was stale, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke, a sharp contrast to the crisp night air Daniel had once patrolled with Shadow at his side. The walls, painted in a dull, lifeless gray, seemed to close in on him, making the space feel smaller with each passing second. A one-way mirror loomed to his left, reflecting his own tired, unshaven face back at him. A face of a man who had lost everything overnight. Somewhere beyond that glass, unseen eyes were watching, dissecting his every move, waiting for him to break. But Daniel wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Outside the room, the station was eerily quiet, too quiet. He had spent years in this very precinct, where the steady buzz of voices, ringing phones, and the occasional burst of laughter had once filled the halls. Now, it was as if the building itself had turned against him, treating him like an intruder in a place he had called home. The chill from the air vents above sent an icy shiver down his spine, making the hair on his arms stand on end. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the officers outside whispered just low enough for him not to hear, or the way they moved past the glass without so much as a glance in his direction. Then there was the clock. The rhythmic ticking of the second hand cut through the silence, each movement a reminder that time was slipping away. Time for what he didn't know. But the weight in his chest grew heavier with every passing moment. And then, through the quiet, he heard it. A low growl. Deep, familiar, unmistakable. Shadow. A surge of adrenaline shot through Daniel's veins. He wasn't alone in this fight. Not yet. But why was Shadow growling? And more importantly, at whom? Daniel Hayes had spent 15 years on the force, earning a reputation as one of the most dedicated K-9 officers in the precinct. He wasn't just a cop. He was a man who lived by the badge, by loyalty, and by the unbreakable bond he shared with his partner, Shadow. A Belgian Malinois trained to take down criminals twice Daniel's size. Shadow wasn't just his dog. He was his lifeline, his only real family. After his wife left years ago, unable to cope with the dangers of his job, and his parents passed away, Daniel had poured everything into his work. Shadow had been there through it all, watching his six, sleeping at the foot of his bed, licking his wounds, both the physical and the ones no one could see. But now, for the first time, Daniel felt completely and utterly alone. Framed, betrayed, sitting in this interrogation room like a common criminal, with every pair of eyes in the station suddenly looking at him as if they'd never known the man behind the badge. He kept replaying the events in his head. The botched drug bust, the missing evidence, the deposit that had somehow appeared in his bank account. It was a setup so perfect it made him sick. He had spent his career putting people like this behind bars, and now he was the one in cuffs. Sergeant Miller, his former mentor, had barely looked at him when they took his badge and gun. The younger officers, rookies he had trained, kept their distance, whispering like he was a ghost haunting the halls. But the one thing that cut the deepest was that they had taken Shadow away. His partner, his best friend. A dog who would never understand why he wasn't by Daniel's side, why his handler had suddenly vanished. And yet, the growl Daniel had heard, it had been Shadow. He knew that sound, the way the dog's throat rumbled when he sensed something was wrong. But what was Shadow seeing that Daniel couldn't? Why did his growl carry something deeper than warning? Something that sounded almost like fear. Daniel sat in the holding cell, his mind racing. The steel bars felt colder than they should have. The air thick with something unseen but suffocating. He had faced criminals, drug lords, and violent offenders, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. He wasn't afraid of losing his badge. He was afraid of what would happen to Shadow. His partner was out there, and something wasn't right. The growl he'd heard still echoed in his mind. Shadow was trained to detect danger, to sense threats before they appeared. If the dog was growling like that, it meant something was terribly wrong. He needed to get out of here. A guard, Officer Reynolds, approached the cell, his face unreadable. "You've got a visitor," he muttered before unlocking the door. Daniel was led into a dimly lit room where Sergeant Miller sat, arms crossed, his expression heavy with something between doubt and pity. "You set me up," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. Miller exhaled sharply. "You really think that?" He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were crime scene photos, evidence that was supposedly missing, now conveniently found, all pointing to him. "It's airtight, Hayes. The money's in your account. The drugs were in your locker. Surveillance footage shows you there." Daniel's blood ran cold. He hadn't touched that evidence. He hadn't taken any money, and yet the proof was overwhelming. He flipped through the pages, his pulse hammering. The timestamps on the footage. The way his figure moved in the grainy black and white recording. It looked exactly like him. But something was off. "This isn't me," he said, pushing the folder away. Miller frowned. "You expect me to believe that?" "Yes." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because I was home that night. With Shadow." Miller studied him, then leaned in. "Your dog," he murmured. "You kept saying something was wrong with him." Daniel nodded. "He was acting strange. He growled at something in the house. Something I couldn't see." Miller tapped the folder. "You know how that sounds?" "I don't care how it sounds." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Someone wants me out of the way. They faked this footage. They planted evidence. And Shadow, he knew. That's why he growled. He saw something I didn't." Miller hesitated for a long moment before sighing. "Look, I can't stop what's happening, but I pulled some strings. You've got 5 minutes to see your dog before they transfer him to another handler." Daniel didn't wait. Escorted by Reynolds, he was led through the station to the K9 kennels. The moment the door opened, a low, rumbling growl filled the room. Shadow was in his cage, his fur bristling. His eyes locked onto Daniel with something desperate, something almost human. The moment their eyes met, the growl stopped. Shadow whined, pressing against the bars, his body trembling. Daniel crouched down. "Hey, buddy. It's okay." Shadow didn't respond the way he usually did. No tail wag, no relieved sigh. Instead, his ears stayed pinned back, and his body remained stiff, like he was still on high alert. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "He's been like that since you left. Won't let anyone near him." Daniel reached through the bars, running his hand over Shadow's fur. "What did you see, boy?" he whispered. Shadow's body twitched. Then, suddenly, he snapped his head toward the far side of the room and let out another growl, low, guttural, primal. Daniel followed his gaze, his pulse spiking. The room was empty, but Shadow wasn't barking at nothing. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood up. "Open the cage," he said. Reynolds hesitated. "I'm not supposed to." "Open it." Something in Daniel's voice made the officer comply. The moment the latch clicked, Shadow lunged. Not at Daniel, but at the air, his teeth snapping, his body twisting as if he were fighting something unseen. Then the lights flickered. A gust of cold air swept through the room, making Daniel's skin prickle. Shadow let out a sharp yelp, stumbling back, his paws skidding against the floor. Daniel rushed forward, grabbing his dog just as the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. Then a whisper, not from Reynolds, not from Daniel. A voice, faint and slithering, right next to his ear. "Leave." The lights snapped back on. Reynolds was pale, his gun half drawn, his eyes darting around the room. What the hell was that? Daniel held onto Shadow, his dog still trembling. He had no idea what just happened. But he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about a setup. Something far worse was at play. Daniel walked out of the station with Shadow pressed tightly against his leg, the dog's body still tense. The night was colder than it should have been, the air thick with moisture as if a storm was looming, yet the sky remained eerily clear. Every shadow along the parking lot stretched unnaturally long, the streetlights flickering in rhythmic pulses. He had spent years trusting his instincts, but now they screamed at him. Something was following them. The sensation of being watched crawled up his spine, not from a person, but from something unseen, something that slithered between reality and nightmare. He opened his car door, and Shadow hesitated before jumping in, his ears still pinned back. The dog wasn't just on edge, he was terrified. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his pulse steady but his breathing shallow. As he turned the key in the ignition, the dashboard flickered for a moment before the engine roared to life. He checked his rearview mirror, expecting to see an empty lot behind him. Instead, there was a figure. A tall, indistinct shape stood beneath the farthest street lamp, featureless, like a void cut out of existence itself. His breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It was just there, absorbing the light, its presence unnatural and suffocating. Shadow let out a deep, guttural growl. Daniel blinked. The figure was gone. A hallucination? Stress playing tricks on him? He wasn't sure, but he didn't plan on waiting to find out. He shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the lot, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He told himself it was over, that once he got home, he could think clearly, figure out who framed him, and make a plan. But Shadow didn't stop growling. The ride home was unervingly silent, save for the occasional rumble of Shadow's throat. Daniel kept checking his mirrors, feeling the weight of something just beyond his sight. His house came into view, standing alone at the end of the darkened street. It was home, yet tonight it felt foreign. As he parked and stepped out, Shadow hesitated again. He didn't jump out immediately like he usually did. Instead, he sniffed the air, his hackles rising. Then the porch light flickered. A small detail, insignificant on its own, but something about it sent a chill through Daniel's core. Shadow let out a short, sharp bark. Then the door creaked open. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't unlocked it. He hadn't even touched the handle. His hand instinctively reached for his gun, except he didn't have it. They'd taken it when they arrested him. He was unarmed, vulnerable. Shadow stepped forward first, his body tense, his tail low, his stance protective. Daniel followed, his movements slow and deliberate. He pushed the door open wider. The house swallowed in darkness. The air inside smelled off, like something stale and wrong, as if the walls had been holding their breath, waiting for him to return. Then the whispers started. Soft, indistinct, coming from the hallway. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Shadow growled, the fur along his back standing on end. The sound was low, menacing, the kind of growl meant for something that didn't belong. Daniel's mouth went dry. He reached for the light switch. Nothing. The house remained cloaked in darkness. A shuffle. Not from him. Not from Shadow. Something was inside. Then, a sudden, deafening bang from upstairs. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Shadow barked furiously, lunging toward the staircase, but Daniel grabbed his collar, holding him back. He needed to think. He needed to. A shadow moved. Not on the floor. On the ceiling. A twisted, elongated shape slithered across it, shifting unnaturally, stretching as if it didn't obey the laws of physics. It clung to the ceiling like an insect, except it was far too big, far too human. Then the voice came again, this time right behind him. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice sent a jolt through Daniel's body like an electric shock. He spun around, fists clenched, expecting something to be standing there. But there was nothing, only the yawning darkness of his house, stretching out before him like an open grave. Shadow barked, his body rigid, his gaze locked onto something above. Daniel followed his dog's eyes, and his stomach lurched. The thing on the ceiling was no longer just a shadow. It had taken shape, a grotesque, human-like figure twisted beyond recognition. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers stretched like talons, its face a writhing void of shifting features, as if it couldn't decide what to become. And it was watching him. Then it moved. With impossible speed, it scuttled across the ceiling like a spider, its head snapping downward, its mouth stretching wide. A sickening, guttural hiss filled the air as it launched itself toward him. Daniel threw himself backward, crashing into the hallway wall just as the thing slammed onto the floor where he had been standing. Shadow lunged, snapping his jaws, but the creature barely reacted. It twisted its head toward the dog, and for a fraction of a second, its face, if it could be called that, shifted. A grin, a mockery of something human. Then it lunged at Shadow. "No!" Daniel roared, grabbing the closest object, an old metal lamp from the table beside him, and swinging it with every ounce of strength he had. The lamp connected with a sickening crack, sending the thing reeling back. Shadow didn't hesitate. He barreled into the creature, his teeth sinking deep into its arm, if it even had an arm. The thing shrieked, the sound ear-piercing, raw, inhuman. Shadow held on, refusing to let go, but the creature twisted unnaturally, its body bending in ways that defied reality. With one swift motion, it threw the dog across the hallway. Shadow yelped as he hit the ground. Rage and terror collided inside Daniel. He didn't think. He acted. Charging forward, he tackled the thing, driving it toward the stairs. They hit the steps hard, tumbling downward in a violent spiral. Daniel felt bone-crushing pain explode in his ribs. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to end this. They crashed onto the floor below. Daniel scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath. The creature twitched, its body jerking as if it were resetting itself. And then it spoke. "You can't escape, Daniel." His blood turned to ice. It knew his name. It had always known. He grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. The creature began to rise, its limbs snapping back into place with sickening pops. Then he heard the low growl. Shadow. The dog was back on his feet, his fur bristling, his eyes locked onto the thing. And then, in perfect unison, they attacked. Daniel swung with everything he had. The poker connected with the creature's head, sending it stumbling backward. Shadow lunged, his jaws finding purchase again. They didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Strike after strike, bite after bite, they forced it back inch by inch. Then, the thing shrieked, a sound so ear-splitting it rattled the windows. Its body began to convulse, its form breaking apart, unraveling into tendrils of inky darkness. The walls trembled, the floor groaned, the air itself seemed to crack. And then silence. The thing was gone. Daniel stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking, his body aching from head to toe. Shadow limped to his side, pressing against his leg. It was over, or so he thought, because as he turned toward the front door, ready to leave, the house whispered one final time. "See you soon." Daniel sat on the porch, his back against the cold wooden railing, staring at the quiet night beyond. The town still slept, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within his house. His ribs ached, his hands trembled, and his mind reeled from the impossible. Shadow lay beside him, his breathing steady but alert, ears twitching at every distant sound. The creature was gone. But was it really? He thought about the voice, those final words. See you soon. A warning? Promise? Or just a cruel joke from something beyond his understanding? He had fought, he had survived, but he didn't feel victorious. If anything, he felt like he had merely bought himself time. The house behind him stood in eerie silence. Nothing moved, nothing whispered, yet it felt alive, watching, waiting. Had he truly banished whatever had taken root there, or had it simply retreated, lurking just out of sight, biding its time? Daniel had spent his life believing in logic, in what could be explained. But now he knew better. Some things defied reason. Some nightmares didn't end when the sun came up. Shadow nudged his hand, grounding him in reality. Whatever was out there, whatever waited in the dark, he wasn't alone. But deep inside, he knew one truth. This wasn't over. What do you think really happened to Daniel that night? Was the entity truly gone? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to return? And what about the voice that whispered, "See you soon"? Was it a warning or a curse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were in Daniel's shoes, would you have stayed in that house after everything that happened? Or would you have run and never looked back? We want to hear your theories. Every detail counts. If you enjoyed the story and want more chilling tales like this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you even more terrifying mysteries, unsolved horrors, and stories that will keep you up at night. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next dark tale, because the next story might be even more unsettling than this one. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some things are better left unexplored. See you in the next one. If you dare.